Okay, good morning, everybody. This is part two of three, the new normal for the buyer side of the transaction. So what we're going to do here is we're going to review the addendums to the buyer broker compensation agreement. There are multiple forms that are affiliated and associated with the document that are specified in the document. So I'm going to go through those with you. These are the addendums to the BBRC. First is the buyer identification of preferences and priorities. So the BIPP, you're on the buyer broker agreement. You are going to specify an area. You're going to identify what type of property that you're looking for. And then what this document does, it's optional to attach to the BBRC, and it's used to identify the preferences and priorities of a buyer. It can change, so it can change from time to time. So there's a number at the top, much like an addendum or a modification of terms, number one, number two, number three, number four. So you could, God forbid, be caught in a situation where the buyer changes what they're looking for. They want to change their preferences. What is binding on the transaction as far as you receiving compensation is what is on the actual buyer broker agreement. This is supplemental information, but it does not create a situation where if you don't find specifically this property that you would be excluded from receiving compensation. So that's a kind of a clear distinction. So paragraph 1 identifies the parties, much like all the other documents. Paragraph 2, identification of the buyer preferences. So they put in writing those preferences that they have. Represents a general expression of the buyer's needs, wants, and concerns as of the date on the document. So again, this just helps them kind of narrow in their wish list. The broker will use the information to narrow the search for the buyer, just like you have in the past. Paragraph 3 identifies what the elements are. So 3A is the price range, 3B is the property use, whether it's going to be a primary residence, second home, investment property, et cetera. 3C, the property type, single family residence, or some other property type. 3D, the property features. 3E, the property location. 3F, other features, matters of concern or importance to the buyer. So they would be able to provide under other if there's something else that they want to specify to you. Paragraph 4 reminds and helps the buyer understand that the information that they're providing is confidential. You're not going to be sharing that with anybody else. It's basically for your use to help them find and narrow in on what exactly it is that's important to them. Paragraph 5, changes to preferences and priorities. Basically, the buyer is agreeing to notify the broker of any changes of this criteria. In the past, we kind of just did it on the fly. Sometimes we'd be driving around, we'd look at a property, and then we would narrow in, we would change things. Well, this is a formal way of documenting what those preferences and priorities are for that particular buyer. And then simply acknowledgement and signature. This is an optional document. It is not something that is required, but you may find it useful in working with your buyer and helping them narrow in their search. This is the buyer financial and personal information. Again, optional document. However, it does say, and it does obligate, the buyer is obligated to provide this information and provide this document to you within 5 days of you actually entering into an agreement with them. And so it is an important document. It's only required. However, I would say that if you're only going to require it for certain people, I'd be careful with that because you could get caught up in a situation where there might be a discrimination issue. If it's going to be used, I'd recommend that you use it for everybody. You don't use it just for one person, okay? Or you don't use it for a certain type of person, let's say a first-time buyer, and not for someone else. I would highly recommend that you make sure that you use it across the board if you're using it, and I would recommend that you use it. So identifying the properties. Paragraph 2 is the buyer's personal and financial information. The buyer to verify personal and financial information so broker can best serve the client's needs. It's just a disclosure to them why you're requesting this document, because it's new. Buyers have never had to do this. Typically, they have to do it when they work with a lender, but they typically are not going through this process and providing this detailed of information in writing to a buyer's agent. Paragraph 3 specifies the information. So the property financing information. So how much deposit do they have available to them? How much down payment do they have available to them? What are the sources of the deposit and the down payment? How much do they have available for broker compensation and costs? What do you mean? I have to pay broker compensation? So that's going to be, one of those ways of bridging that conversation. Well, yeah, you do have to pay. You're obligating. I have to get paid. And the way that the world works now is there's not an amount that's offered by the other side. So we have to enter into this agreement. And by the way, everybody has to do this. It's not just me. And so we're going to negotiate that into the transaction, hopefully, much as we always have, but we have to formalize it here in this document. Paragraph 3E, the source of these funds. So what are the source of the funds? 3F, have you talked to a lender? What is the max loan amount? What are you comfortable with? I find, and from my experience with lending over a 10-year period, I find that in our market, it's typically not what people qualify for, what is their maximum loan amount, because they're buying second homes. It's more about what they feel comfortable with on a monthly payment. So that might be something else you want to factor in is, gee, what is the, what do you feel comfortable with? Which is 3I down below, obviously. So max loan amount, 3G is the lender information. Have you talked to a lender? Have you been pre-qualified? If not, you want to make sure that you put them in the hands of someone that you know and trust and that will take care of them. And so making a referral out to a local partner would be definitely appropriate and preferred. And then what type of financing are they doing? And then max monthly housing expense. What do you feel comfortable with? Or what is the maximum you've been told that you qualify? Okay, paragraph 4, other financial information. So whether or not they are doing a 1031 exchange, settlement, inheritance, there are check boxes available if they want to identify if there's something special about the transaction. Paragraph 4B, whether or not it is contingent upon the sale of another property. So you would incorporate the COP in that, have a conversation about how that works in the transaction. And then paragraph 3C, if there's something else that they need to provide as far as information, then you have the ability to provide that. Paragraph 5 launches into the personal side of the information. 5A, current housing, whether they own or they rent, what is their current situation? Other, maybe if they're living with somebody else or they've got some type of temporary housing. 5B, property ownership experience. 5C, real estate related experience, whether or not they're a broker or they're a service provider, there's some kind of affiliated. So you can gauge what sort of or what level of expertise or understanding they have. If they're not in the real estate industry, even if they are in the real estate industry, they may not understand what's going on in the current conditions. Time constraints, urgency, if there's something, they got to get the kids in school, starting a new job, having an understanding of what kind of time constraints or issues they may have on that. Reason for the purchase. Why are you buying? Why are you coming to Lake Arrowhead? And then 5F would be other, anything else that they would like to share of personal nature. And then just like with all the other documents, again, you're asking for information. Paragraph 6, information is confidential. So you reiterate to them that you are not going to be using the information for anything other than your own purposes. Paragraph 7, identification and changes to financial and personal information. So the buyer is verifying that there's nothing financially or personally that would prevent them from purchasing. They're also agreeing to notify you and let you know if something changes, much like a lender, right? The lender wants to know if there's any change in status, if you lose your job. That stuff is going to get found out. So it's important that the buyer keep you abreast so that you can help them react and deal with the situation. Surprises typically, aren't aren't something that you want to see in a real estate transaction. And this is putting the buyer on notice that they need to notify you if something changes. And then lastly, for the document, acknowledgement and signatures. So when we come to the end of a buyer broker agreement, whether it be expiration of that time period, you come to the end of the 90 days and they don't extend it. Presumably you've done some work on some properties, you have some broker involvement. So you would be entitled to compensation on those properties if something comes together within the time period that you've specified. And so the document that you use is the NBIP document, which we're going to go over here. And it needs to be delivered prior to the expiration of any agreement or within 5 days of any cancellation of a buyer broker agreement. So paragraph 1, again, identifies the parties, the broker and the buyer, and it references the date of the buyer broker agreement. Paragraph 2, the representation period confirms the dates in the buyer broker agreement or any extension. And then paragraph 3 talks about the compensation agreement, and it reiterates the agreement outlined in the BBRC. So it's putting the buyer on notice. Hey, I'm due something if you do something within the terms of our buyer broker agreement. So 3A, buyer enters into a contract on a property where the broker was involved and the property and properly registered within the specified number of days, and the transaction happened within the continuation period. So it's fairly narrow. You need to make sure all those things are happening. But under those circumstances, the buyer needs to be aware that you could be due a commission or you are due a commission if all those things are met. Paragraph 3B, buyer enters into a contract on a property where the broker was involved and the property was properly registered no later than 5 days after the cancellation. So that's the distinction between expiration is 3A and then cancellation is 3B, either with the broker canceling or the buyer canceling. Paragraph 4, broker involved properties. So this is where you would list all of the broker involved properties. And we've gone through that before. What constitutes broker involved properties? But this is where you would complete that. And then there is a checkbox if you need to attach a list. So if you have a list, and that's why it's going to be important for you to make sure that you're keeping track. Before it wasn't as critical that you maintained a list of the properties that you showed to somebody or that you had broker involvement on. So make sure that you have a record of that so that it's easy for you and you have it at your fingertips when you're ready to complete this form. Paragraph 5, again, notifying the new broker puts the buyer on notice. They should provide this information to any other brokers. I'd recommend that they provide the document to them so that the other broker is put on notice that, hey, if you get involved in any of these other properties, there's an obligation. Failure to do so could obligate the buyer to having to pay 2 brokers. Just like on a listing agreement. If you sign a listing agreement, exclusive listing agreement, or a listing agreement with 2 parties, the seller has that potential liability. Paragraph 6, the date of the notice. So the date is emphasized because the document is time sensitive. So having the notice date is important. And then lastly, for this document, the acknowledgement and signature of the document. So this document, the form BMI-SP, is the form that the buyer utilizes to inform the seller of any material issues, okay, specific to a property. So if there's something that they want to notify the buyer's broker, this is the document that you would utilize. And this is an addendum to the buyer broker agreement. So paragraph 1, again, parties and the property. So you're identifying for a specific property, not just in general, but this is concerns about a specific property. Paragraph 2, the buyer's obligation to disclose material issues so that you have all the information so that you can help them. The buyer rep agreement specifies the buyer will disclose to the broker any material issues that they may have. This document allows the opportunity to do that. The buyer disclosure is paragraph 3, so there's some lines that they can specify what those concerns are. So you list the material issues that the buyer has. Paragraph 4, buyer representation. The buyer represents that they have disclosed all of their material issues regarding the features, issues, and concerns. Obviously, at that moment, obviously things could come up, but this is a tool for you to have all the information that you need from the buyer. Again, optional. This isn't something that is a required document. And then lastly on this, again, acknowledgement and signature. So they're acknowledging and by signing below that this document is incorporated into the agreement. Okay, so that's it for part 2. Those are all the addendums that are attached, for the commonly used addendums to the buyer broker agreement. Please post any questions you may have to Mastermind, or send any questions via text if you don't have access to our Mastermind. I will post shortly part 3, which has to do with the buyer broker light, the property showing and representation agreement, and the open house and visitor non-agency agreement. That is the third part of our session. Hope this is helpful to you. Please let me know if you have any questions or need clarification on any of the information. Thank you.